Morning, and first let me say that I had an opportunity last night to watch President Obama's address, which he says isn't about amnesty, but which a great many Americans say absolutely is. One of my first conclusions was that the Ferengi want their ears back. In fact, it makes me wonder if someone were to touch the edges of President Obama's ears, would he get a thrill the same way that the Star Trek characters do? On more serious notes this morning, let's start with a couple of observations here. Number one, the president does not have the authority. You've been hearing that from a lot of different sources over the last several days. Let me just tell you something about the history of what are called executive orders, which go all the way back to President Washington, the very first president of the United States, in case you Democrats listening didn't understand that. Washington issued some executive orders, but these mainly had to deal with things that his office needed. About a year ago, I went to see a presentation by Michael Peroutka. He's a lawyer and a constitutional expert, also runs something called the Institute for the Constitution, and he was saying that executive orders deal only with issues related to the executive branch of the government. That is, if a president decides that they're going to buy blue ink instead of red ink at the White House, and they have a lot of red ink there from time to time, you understand. But that's what the president essentially is doing. He cannot rule, or for those of you liberals listening, she cannot rule by fiat, that is, as an absolute monarch, a king. A lot of Americans simply don't understand how their Constitution works. The president is not the boss of Congress. The president is not the boss of the Supreme Court. These are co-equal branches of the federal government. So, when you hear the president say that he is taking this action, and the big word the media likes is unilaterally, they're absolutely off their rockers. I'm going to tell you right now, a couple of years ago, I had a comment from a friend. I was on Facebook and I criticized the President of the United States. And if I could, I'm going to share something with you from my handy-dandy pocket Constitution here. The friend from high school said, "Why are you continually criticizing our Commander-in-Chief?" Now, to note, my friend from high school, as well as me, we never actually served in the U.S. military, so I don't know that the president would be considered our commander-in-chief. But secondly, there is something in this book called Article 2, Section 2, and it says that the president of the United States is the commander-in-chief when called into service as commander-in-chief. Now, how does that happen? Well, it happens because the Congress of the United States declares war. The co-equal branch that we mentioned a bit earlier, along with the Supreme Court, the triumvirate, if you will, or the trioca. There's a number of ways to describe this, but the Congress, the executive branch, and the judicial system, they're a three-headed hydra, if you will, of the federal government. So when Congress declares war, that in effect makes the president commander-in-chief. Now, how often does Congress declare war? The last time was actually in December of 1941. A great many of you watching this weren't even alive at the time. A great many of your parents weren't even alive at the time. My mother was all of 18 months old or so, and she's been dead now a good 10 years. It tells you it's been a very, very long time. The last, then, technically, commander-in-chief that the United States had in wartime was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and likely you could say his successor as well, Harry Truman, in prosecuting that war. Ever since then, no dice. Now, I'm going to tell you a couple of other things. They don't expect you to get this. Remember this fellow a couple of weeks ago, Jonathan Gruber? All of these videos started surfacing, and Mr. Gruber was saying, he was telling people that Americans are too dumb to understand the whole notion of Obamacare. In other words, you're dumber than boxes of rocks, and therefore it's easy to sell you a bill of goods. Well, that's what they hope continues when it comes to something along the lines of saying that the president has the authority to legalize 5 million illegal immigrants, because they know that a great many Americans just simply don't have a solid understanding of the Constitution. I'm going to give you an example. A couple of years back, 4 years ago, in fact now, I'm looking back to 2010, there was a woman running for United States House of Representatives from my home state of Delaware. She was at a public forum, I happened to be in attendance, when she was asked to name the 5 liberties that are mentioned in the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. Now, the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, they don't just outline 10 liberties. Many of them are multifaceted, just like your federal government executive branch congressional, legislative branch and your judicial branch, are all actually just parts, multifaceted parts of the actual government. There are 5 liberties that are mentioned in the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. The candidate running for House of Representatives happened to be a constitutional lawyer. She couldn't name them. She got a couple and then did a Rick Perry. She started counting her fingers trying to figure out what the others were. She ended up losing at a primary. She blamed much of that on a talk radio host who looked suspiciously like me for her own foibles. I didn't go up there and twist her arm while she was trying to come up with those 5. But for those of you who are challenged on this, I've written a list down. Perhaps you can actually see this. I'm very high-tech when I'm doing this. But what we're talking about, you have freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition. All of those in the First Amendment. Now, we need to point out, the government does not grant you those rights. Those rights existed long before any government ever existed. It's called natural law. Liberals don't like to hear that because, of course, it gets in the way of them trying to govern however they feel day by day. In other words, see which direction the wind is blowing and what best suits our own needs. The ends justify the means. I'm telling you right now, the President of the United States is in violation of an oath that he took to the Constitution when he was sworn in twice, 2009 and in 2013. And until we get this through our noggins, that this has long-term serious repercussions, we're going to be in some serious trouble trying to keep the American experiment together. Just a few thoughts today on the President's remarks last night, and I hope that those help out somewhat. And people will say, and I heard this last night from some of the commentaries coming from the left, well, you know, your guys did these executive orders too. They did. Let's be honest. It's time to bring them to a stop. It's time to return this government to its constitutional roots. God help us all. Mr. Producer, can you turn the video off now? Okay, I guess I'll have to once again do it myself. Goodbye. Somebody's got to get a technician in here for me.